And now we'll get a better understanding of where urban forest is now, where we're going. So I hope you'll enjoy Emily's short talk. So we'll move on to our Zoom reminders. I think you all know it, but it's always good to review. So again, everyone's automatically muted. Active speaker active speaker view is best. We will be using the chat. You can also use the chat to put any questions at any time. And we will absolutely have time for questions and maybe some open discussion as well. So we'll move on to our book club agreements, give space, take space. Definitely feel free to use that hand raise if you'd like to ask your own question, and you will be given permission to unmute. And please participate as much as you would like. It always makes it better. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce our speaker this evening. Emily Nobel Maxwell is the director of the Nature Conservancy Cities program in New York and has dedicated her career to environmental justice and urban greening. An architect of the New York City Urban Forest Agenda, she serves on the leadership team of Forest for All NYC, working to protect, maintain, expand, and promote the New York City urban forests to benefit all New Yorkers justly and equitably. She co-authored The State of the Urban Forest in NYC. Emily helped launch TNC's North America Cities Network. She is a Doris Duke Conservation and Ford Fellow, and she previously served as Associate Director of National Wildlife Federation's Northeast Regional Center, leading urban school sustainability programs, mobilized and connected neighborhood action for New York City parks at Partnerships for Parks, coordinated a community greening initiative in Philadelphia. She has taught at Lesley University's Urban Environmental Leadership Program and founded the More Gardens Coalition, an organization key to protecting NYC's community gardens. Emily is an author of Building Capacity Through Diversity and Urban Coastal Resilience, Valuing Nature's Role. She has a BA in Urban Studies and MS in Natural Resource Policy with specialization in environmental justice. In her spare time, if she has any, she can be found exploring the diverse birds and mushrooms of New York City and the Adirondacks. And it's my absolute pleasure to pass it over to you, Emily. We will give you a second to get your slides up.
Great. Give me 1 second here. It's so great to be with all of you. Thank you so much, Jessica, for the warm welcome, and also Ayana and Tasha for all the work you did to organize this. And thanks to all of you for joining and reading and being passionate about trees. I think that's why we're all here. And so I'm just really happy to be with you all. I am calling in from somewhere where there are a lot of beetles in the house. And so if you see me startle, probably a beetle has landed on me, which is kind of, interesting and exciting. So I'm here today, as Jessica said, to share with you about the current state of the urban forest, Forest for All NYC, and the New York City Urban Forest Agenda. And it's really my pleasure to be with you all. And I will just name that Madison Square Park Conservancy is a tremendously important partner to us in Forest for All NYC and is doing so much tremendous landscape work, tree-related work in their own area. And so it's really exciting to be here with y'all. So just briefly, the Nature Conservancy is a global conservation organization. Our mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. We operate in 76 countries, either directly or through partnerships. And we launched our program in New York City about 10 years ago. So our cities program is, even though it's 10 years old, still one of our newest program areas. And we're really excited to dive into the work that we're doing and that so many of our amazing partners are doing. So I wanted to sort of open up with a reminder that the urban forest, particularly in the recent past, has become a thing that gets talked about in the press and that makes headlines. And we're really excited about this because we think it's beginning to gain stature as the truly critical natural infrastructure that it is. And we know that a lot of the work of many of our partners helps generate this media, but most importantly, we're excited for the urban forest to start getting its due. Our initiative at the Nature Conservancy is called Future Forest NYC. And we basically generate good science, work in partnership with others, convene leaders, and try to advocate policy. And there's a couple of core products that I want to tell you about. All of them can be found in the link tree that Ayana placed in the chat. We did recently release the State of the Urban Forest in New York City, and a lot of what I'm sharing tonight is me pulling information directly from that, but that's freely available to you if you want to really geek out on trees. We encourage it, but we know some folks do prefer that Cliff Notes version. We also will be talking tonight about the New York City Urban Forest Agenda, which Madison Square Parks Conservancy is a terrific partner in advocating through Forest for All NYC. And we will, of course, be talking about Forest for All NYC and our collective agenda for the urban forest in New York City. So why does an organization like the Nature Conservancy care about the urban forest? Well, we know that climate change impacts are real and they are here and they are getting stronger and worse. So we know that with climate projections from the New York Panel on Climate Change, that by the 2080s, essentially, probably sooner, we'll have up to 5 times the number of extreme heat days and about 1.5 times the amount of extreme precipitation. That's actually by 2050. And particularly with extreme heat, and we'll take a look at this together more deeply in a moment, extreme heat is the #1 weather-related cause of death in the United States. And here in New York City, as in many places, it's not equitable. And we know that Black New Yorkers are more likely to die from extreme heat than their other counterparts in the city. So this is a really big deal to us. And I want to just draw your attention. I'm going to be showing you a lot of maps, and I'll tell you something interesting. I'm not the most visual person. It takes me a minute to process visual information. I'll try to draw your attention to some key parts so you can take that look, and don't feel bad if you need to get close to your screen. We can be a little cozy with each other. So here on the left, you have a map of tree canopy and grass and shrubs. So total vegetation in the city, and where it's more green, we have more vegetation. And on the right, we have surface temperature on like a summer day. So when it tends to be quite hot, and where we have more purple, it's cooler. Where we have that like red, orange, yellow to even white spectrum, it's hotter. And so what we can see is that there's a very strong correlation. Where we have more vegetation, the surface temperature tends to be cooler on a hot summer day. And that's a big deal because our vegetation isn't distributed equitably. So trees are one part of vegetation. There is other kinds, grass and shrubs, as I mentioned, but we're here tonight to talk about the urban forest. And the urban forest of New York City includes the over 7 million trees in the city and the physical and social infrastructure that supports them. And I want to note, and we'll talk a little more about this later, that these trees, they span all kinds of property types. So they're in parks like Madison Square, they're on our streets, our rights of way, they're in our homes, our backyards, our institutions, our businesses, and public property of all kinds. So this is a really important and yet really complicated system. And for folks who think about big forests, I think about our urban forest as a highly fragmented forest system. It has tremendous benefits. And I realize y'all probably have thought a lot about these, and the book you read does detail so many of these, particularly looking at the research of folks like Rowan Roundtree and Dave Nowak. So our urban forest, it helps with air pollution, it stores carbon and helps with climate change. It decreases air temperature, which can cool our streets and mitigate urban heat island. But it also has social benefits. It can reduce our stress, which can lead to improved blood pressure even. It can, when we get out there and take care of it together, I know there's a lot of great stewardship at Madison Park, it can actually increase our cohesiveness and our relationships. And part of why this is so important is we know that communities where there are stronger social ties or social cohesion fare better during extreme weather and climate events, or really any natural disaster. Like knowing each other is actually a really important part of surviving climate and weather events. But also our streets and parks that have more trees, adults and children are encouraged to get outside more, get more exercise, be healthier. And trees can help with water quality, water filtration, get that water quality better before it hits our harbor. And of course, for those of us who are like kind of nature nuts, like I'm a little bit of one, our urban forest plays a really important role as habitat, thinking about resident and migratory insects and also birds, and also insects and mammals as well. So I want to start kind of helping you visualize our tree canopy and how it's distributed. We're going to look at it at a few different scales and in comparison to a few different factors. And if any of this, if you're just like, what the heck is going on? I promise you we'll get to your questions. So when we look at tree canopy across New York City, the average number of the whole city is about 22%. That's our total canopy. But when we break that out, we see that Staten Island is over 30%, whereas Brooklyn is well below 20. So our boroughs are not equal in their canopy cover. And this disparity, this difference increases when we look at finer and finer scales. So we can see that some neighborhoods in New York City have like 3% canopy cover, which is pretty low. I'm thinking, we can look at those whiter areas, central western Brooklyn and Queens, for example, whereas areas like the Northwest Bronx, Riverdale, that's really high, like up to 78%. So there's a lot of disparity in the canopy distribution. And we also know that canopy is changing over time. And you might wonder, like, why are we looking at 2010 to 2017? We're looking at those dates because those are the time points that we have good data for that we can compare. We're hoping in the next year and a half, we're going to be able to update that, but this data can be challenging to access. So we know that from about 2010 to 2017, that overall tree canopy increased from about 20% to 22% across the city. So that's a good trend line, about 2% increase as the city as a whole. But here again, when we look at different areas, some are growing more than others. And that's at the borough scale and at the neighborhood scale. So I want to draw your attention particularly to the map on the right. The yellows, reds, and oranges, those are actually areas where we saw decreases in tree canopy. So there can be areas of high growth or any growth, and then there can be areas where we're actually facing loss. There's not been a rigorous study yet, but our hypothesis, which I think you'll understand when I say it, is a lot of this loss that we're seeing, particularly if we look at that Jamaica Bay coastal area, is associated with extreme storm events. So Superstorm Sandy was in this time frame, and we did lose a significant amount of tree canopy at that time. So our tree canopy can face different types of loss. Extreme storm events aren't the only driver, but they are a really important driver, which you see can kind of change things at a fairly high magnitude. So another way that I like to do this, because I'm like kind of a political wonk and I'm our lobbyist, is I like to think about this in council districts. And I would encourage you to try to identify your council district on this map. Take a good look at it and think about what's the canopy cover in your council district and how much did it change over time. So again, this is just different ways we can visualize information. We can also look at it at the community board level. And if you want to, at the end of the presentation, you could shout out what's happening in your district based on this map if you want to kind of take that away. And of course, all this information can be found if you need a little more time to process it in the documents that are in the chat. But importantly, tree canopy is a critical factor in heat vulnerability. So the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene released what's called the Heat Vulnerability Index. And an index is just a roll-up of different factors that sort of drive what is, in this case, vulnerability to heat. And vulnerability really means who is more likely to get sick or die from extreme heat. And so areas 4 and 5, so those darker reds and brick colors, are the most heat vulnerable. And I want to name every community in New York City is vulnerable to heat, but certain communities are more vulnerable. And these tend to be communities that have more people of color, more low-income people, more people of a certain age, and also less tree canopy. And so we can see a strong correlation between tree canopy and heat vulnerability. And this is really important to us. And another way to look at this is social vulnerability, which is another index that looks at a variety of attributes in a person's sort of social history. And we know that folks with higher social vulnerability also tend to have less tree canopy. So one of the things that the Nature Conservancy wanted to do was to take a look at where could canopy effectively be added. And we use this really bland word called practical. And we use that word because we wanted to look at where you could do it with the greatest ease in terms of canopy expanding and being able to do that in surfaces that were fairly easy to adjust without major retrofits. And what we found, I think importantly, is that there is room for the canopy to expand practically in every community in New York City. Now, that's not equitable. And sometimes what we've observed is that our lowest canopy areas also tend to have less availability for canopy expansion without fairly major overhauls of that landscape. But that's sort of the tough news. So we might have to work harder in some neighborhoods to really expand canopy by thinking about things like streetscape design and zoning. But we do know, again, that in every neighborhood, there's already an opportunity to expand canopy. So this is really exciting. And what you see on the right, because I realize I'm throwing a lot of data at you, is what's called practical plus existing canopy. So if we protected the canopy we have as of 2017, which you've already taken a look at, and we added, we can get pretty far with that. And so that's really exciting and good news for New York. I do want to say with existing canopy, coming back to it, that it's a really interesting breakdown when you understand where is canopy and who manages it in our city. So citywide, the Parks Department is responsible for about 53.5% of our canopy. So that means nearly 47% is not in the jurisdiction of New York City Parks. And so New York City Parks, one might argue, and we will take a look at this together, they really do the best tree management in the city, and they're probably pretty underfunded to do it. But that other 47%, that's a big question mark. And so private property owners account for almost just over 35% of our canopy. And yet there's really no rules or regs for private property owners protecting their trees or caring for them. And a lot of our public agencies that own that other percent in between, they don't necessarily have a mandate to care for the urban forest. So that section can also be unplanned for. So it's tremendously important, by the way, to have partners like Madison Square Park Conservancy who are attending so deeply to the landscape in their own park. That's a huge boon to our Parks Department and to our urban forest. But I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't flag that the New York City Parks budget is on average over about the last 5 years, just over 0.3% of the total city budget. Many advocates are calling for it to be expanded to at least 1%. But then when we take a deeper dive into the forestry budget, that is less than, it's basically 0.04%. So we are spending not a lot of money on a really big and important asset. So a lot of what we do is we do advocacy to make sure that the urban forest is cared for. So just to summarize, our trees face a lot of challenges: climate change, pests and pathogens, disparate management, protection, and lacking a planning and coordinated vision. And you read a lot about these as themes in your book club book. So all of these reasons are the reasons that we launched Forest for All NYC, and Forest for All NYC was launched by about 50 organizations in support of the New York City Urban Forest Agenda, which about 50 organizations collaboratively wrote over 2 years. Our vision is an urban forest that justly and equitably delivers its multiple benefits to all New Yorkers, and that we have ways to better protect, maintain, use, monitor, understand, promote, and expand our forest. I don't expect you to read this entire list, but you might see organizations you're familiar with on it. We have about 80 coalition members and counting, and I'm really proud to say that not only do we have terrific organizations as members like Madison Square Park Conservancy, we have organizations ranging from New York City Environmental Justice Alliance to the Real Estate Board of New York to government partners who aren't voting members. and everybody in between. So what I can share is that people actually love trees. Like this is a really an apple pie issue, but trees aren't just about trees. And I think you've read a lot about this. They're about our health and well-being. They're about helping us adapt to climate change. They're about increasing environmental justice, connecting to nature. They can be points for coordinating and collaborating. And of course, just they can be really important parts of our ecological systems. So, to that end, we collaboratively advocate the implementation of the New York City Urban Forest Agenda. And I'll go through a bit of that just now. So, one of our top goals is to see the city expand our total canopy cover from the 22% it was as of 2017 to at least 30% by 2035 equitably. And I want to name that's kind of a leap, but we think we can get there with ambitious measures, but that has to include both protecting and maintaining the existing urban forest and expanding to new. So we chose this goal because we view it as visionary, but also achievable. It was informed by data and analysis. So our practical canopy analysis tells us this is possible. We wanted a goal that had a reasonable time horizon, right? So 2030 is close enough to incentivize us, but long enough for trees to actually grow. And it's something folks can talk about. So we hope you'll also perhaps want to talk about it. And I just want to sort of underscore, a lot of times when people hear canopy expansion, the first thing that pops into their head is, okay, planting new trees. That's a hugely important part of our goal, but protecting the existing forest against removal and maintaining it will actually contribute to a huge amount of canopy growth, because the existing trees we have can grow a lot and do a lot for us. We also, though, need to do new plantings and expand our number of trees, our stem count across all jurisdictions, with a heavy focus on under canopied communities. And I would say probably the most heat vulnerable being a top priority. And I'll just name that to do this, we're also going to need to activate private property, whether that's the 1 and 2 family homes, whether that's businesses, institutions like churches and universities, or even just continuing to invest in some of our more natural sites like botanical gardens. So there's a big opportunity in that area. But that's not the only goal of Forest for All NYC. So we also work hard to focus on community scale forest plans. So I've been talking a lot with community boards lately, some of whom have been setting goals for their own neighborhoods. We want to see a master plan for the urban forest fully developed and implemented by the city. We're very interested in developing the workforce for the urban forest, making sure that's just and equitable and that we can get good green jobs for New Yorkers. And we also want to see some good rule changes, make sure that folks really are able to protect trees. One thing that folks don't always think about is the end of a tree's life cycle. So unfortunately, even a healthy tree will die at some point. And what happens with that wood waste is a big deal. It can either be a real sustainability boon and focus on economic development, or it can become part of our waste stream. And then, of course, we're very interested in monitoring the urban forest and celebrating it. So how can you get involved? You can visit our website at Forest for All NYC. And Ayana had put a link in a chat that has that link directly. We'd encourage you to check out the New York City Urban Forest Agenda. We have a lot of other neat materials on there. We have great social media handles that you are welcome to follow and amplify. If you're part of a group and you're not yet part of Forest for All NYC, we are not yet a coalition for individuals, but we will, any group that wants to join, we'd be pleased to. We would encourage you to reach out to your community board, your city council member, the mayor, and ask them to endorse the New York City Urban Forest Agenda and make sure the urban forest is fully funded in this year's budget. But we also want you to get out there and take care of the trees in your own community. And if you don't know how, we can connect you to great folks who can teach you about that. And also just talk with your friends, families, neighbors, coworkers about the importance of trees. So that, I think, will be all of my formal talking for the night, but I really appreciate you indulging me in my passion. And that's my contact information if anybody would like to follow up. And I will stop sharing now.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily. I know that's a lot of information, but it's a lot of really good information. And I think after, going through our book here, that it kind of brings us up to today. So I'd welcome any questions. If you'd like to raise your hand and ask yourself, or please put it in the chat. Go ahead, Kathleen.
Yeah, hi. Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you, Emily. You mentioned about you not being visually oriented as a person, but I wanted to let you know that my friend is taking a course at the New School, and it's how to present data in a visually understandable way. And I had shared the PDF of your new document, The State of the Urban Forest, and she was just thrilled with the information and the way it was presented. And she's really new at learning the names of trees, different kinds of trees. And so there's just such a wealth of information in this document that it's being spread along to a lot of unexpected ways. So thank you.
Well, that's lovely. And I should give a shout out, which I didn't give, which is I may not be the most visual person, but my team is. And we have a terrific graphic designer who I would have to shout out, who worked with us on this. And we, because we have a team with different skills, we do think about how to convey that. So I just know sometimes I need a moment to process. So if you needed a moment to process all that, but that's great, Kathleen. Thank you.
Yeah, no. She's very pleased with it.
That's exciting. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it is.
I'll also just shout out maybe one other member, because I will say I see you there, Ray from James Baldwin Outdoor Learning Center, who's also a member of Forest for All NYC. Just wanted to invite that energy into the space.
Yeah, it's great to have a big group, and to have Ray in our book club is awesome. Always learning.
Yeah, thanks. I do want to just throw out a question, having read the book, and certainly it feels like we're standing on the shoulders of some giants who have really, kind of led the way in advocating for and caring for trees. But I'm also wondering, so much of the book was and I thought Jill might have been on the call tonight, so partly this was a question for her. Any thoughts about the long term? So much of the book is really about the war against pests and disease, and I'm just wondering if how you feel about the use of herbicides and fungicides, the long-term environmental consequences of their use, which would seem to most likely also potentially hurt beneficial insects. And I'm just curious, just to bring that up as a question, if it bothered anybody. What are some alternatives to pest management that don't involve putting more toxins in the environment?
I'm happy to share some reflections, and I think it would be really important to hear from as many folks who would be willing to share. I think, so we actually, before the formal part of the call started, we were talking about how heavy that emphasis was in the book, and it's a real issue. And, in my home life, right, chemicals would never be used. And in my day-to-day, and I have learned from folks who work in the forestry field that there are some circumstances where very targeted chemical application can be the only solution, which doesn't mean it's good. I just want to name that. But where it is there is no other solution, that mechanical or hand-based removal won't work. We're so far past the point of prevention. And so there's a decision point, right, that people who are in those roles have to make of, do we let the ecosystem change, which by the way, some people think like, yeah, like let's let what's called novel ecosystems, right? There's a whole school of ecological theory on novel ecosystems. Let's just let it happen. And some folks think, okay, we really need to be more curating and managing the landscape. And so I guess I will say from a scientific perspective, I have come to understand the use of very targeted chemical interventions. In my eyes, they should be a last resort. And I think there is an open question if they should ever be used because of some of the interrelated issues. And honestly, I don't feel like I'm the most educated person to give you a really clear answer. But I think that maybe the important thing that I think about is in reading those chapters, so much could have been prevented by closer attention and monitoring. I'm thinking about I think how far gone Boston was by the time they got there. And I think that part of the reason we view the New York City urban forest agenda as so important is I think I'm in the ounce of prevention category on this, which is we need to be doing so much more preventative work. Unfortunately, our cities, and I am like an urban ecologist, like this is my passion. We are the port of entry for a lot of pests and pathogens. So investing in that prevention is the best cure. And then the debates around how do you manage once something exists, I guess in some ways, maybe I leave that to people who are more educated in that realm than I am. So I'd love to hear what others think. And Ray, I hope that,
Yeah, no, thank you.
kind of answers you.
I will just add, and please, anyone else who has any thoughts on this matter too, please share. I think for me too, when we talk about any sort of pesticide usage, it's all about scale. I think if you have, a very large hundreds of acres of forest, that's obviously a different management strategy than if you have a backyard with 5 to 10 trees. And I think those people that have smaller parks, small pockets of land that they own, um, pesticides should never really be your go-to, because you have the opportunity to do other manual interventions. But for, land managers that are dealing with like huge amounts and a lot of maybe not diverse canopy, one thing gets infected, you're in big trouble, right? So I think a lot of times it has to do with scale and just what you're willing to lose. And if pesticides, like Emily said, if we just don't have anything else, um, they should always be a last resort. But when the stakes are so high, sometimes I think people see the value in intervening, um, with with a chemical. But yeah, Anne, go ahead.
Thank you for this presentation. I always see such an impetus on planting trees, and yet the conversation seems to fall apart when it comes to caring for the canopy, getting them pruned, making sure that they get watered. For example, I was on the Parks Committee meeting of Community Board 6 last night. They're talking about replacing these trees that died in Ralph Bunche Park. And yet Ralph Bunche Park, it came out in an earlier session, has no water supply. So, and in Dag Hammarskjöld Park, which I work with, I've been trying for years to get the tree canopy pruned, and limbs fall down. They're very dangerous. It's just how do you tackle that part of caring for the trees?
Yeah,
It's people are very enthusiastic about planting trees. It sounds lovely, but they require care. They're like children.
yeah. I mean, they're like children, or they're like infrastructure, right? And we don't, as a society, treat them like infrastructure. And I think that's like the number one challenge, right? Because infrastructure, people understand, like it needs maintenance, it needs staffing. And so part of the reason that our agenda really focuses on improving the city budget is we're aligned Anne, with exactly what you're saying, which is we love aspirational ideas about planting trees, but we actually need to care for what we have, and then we need to add to it. And so, some of the things I can share that we're doing and we would really encourage others to do is, we do get quite involved in city budget advocacy. We do really focus on not only those capital expenses, right, of like, the tree and the tree planting, but the operational expenses of the personnel, the care contracts. And I actually have begun to think, because it's interesting, I've heard now from several community boards, and Kathleen, I just have this feeling I saw you at a community board too recently. So sorry, side note, maybe I did. So, folks are really struggling with water access. And it's something that I think we need to do some innovation around in the city. So I'm from Philadelphia originally, and in Philadelphia, I ran a native plant nursery, and we were able to get a key from the fire department, and we basically had a working agreement where we used a fire hydrant for watering, but we were responsible, and we knew we turned it on, we turned it off, like somebody had control over it. And I think that there might be some interesting methods, but I think we actually need to get some folks from the city and from stewardship groups who care to sit down at a table and innovate on maybe some small pilots to see if we can build a little trust. Because I can see the fire department probably just won't give everybody a wrench for a fire hydrant, and I respect that, but I think we need to innovate around some of that. So I think it's a few things. I think it's giving stewardship groups the basics that they need to do, the amount they can do, but it has to be professionally handled. So the city really needs to invest in watering contracts and pruning contracts and do that more frequently. So to me, it's a big advocacy push, to be honest.
Thank you.
Well, I'll just jump in again. In our community garden that we operate, we actually have to get a fire hydrant permit from the Department of Environmental Protection. So DEP actually handles that permitting. The other thing, and I think this is a great thing about Forest for All, I think the investment in workforce development, around forest areas. I mean, these are, trees, as we know, are such intricate species of life that are really to provide the expertise in caring for those trees, and to have as many, I don't know, tree care professionals out there as they should be as abundant as plumbers and electricians, it seems, especially when you factor in the health benefits of trees. So I just wanted to put a plug in for another Forest for All initiative, which is the workforce development.
Thanks, Ray. You said it well. And I think Kathleen's hand is up, maybe.
Oh, yeah, I think, I live in Lower Manhattan, and I think one of the key factors of, if so much land is in private property in the downtown, we have so many small buildings owned by families, that I think the missing link here are the supers of the buildings. I think they're left to water the tree, they're left to apply pesticide, they're left to handle, like even with the spotted lanternfly infestation. I mean, they were it was a freestyle effort by a lot of supers in our neighborhood that I spoke to. And I think engaging and educating supers of buildings, it's a really important factor for the protection of street trees and trees that are on private property. A lot of supers that I talk to in the East Village, they don't want any leaves on the ground. Everything is about keeping things very neat. That's their top priority. And when you start to talk to people, I mean, they kind of look at a lot of the trees as just like garden statues, that are in the way.
I love that. I mean, I'd love to like brainstorm with this group, right? Because it's funny, I used to do a lot of work on green roofs and like the idea of activating building supers or like school superintendents. Janitors, there's always a lot of focus on that. I wonder if anybody here has ever had a success in activating somebody with a job like that you'd be willing to share.
Well, one thing we've had, as every neighborhood's been bombarded, we've had rats everywhere. And one of the things that we've kind of gotten together, a few of the small buildings to work together, and we've been moderately successful at getting rid of most of them. But it came up about a month ago that people had left out just some garden pots, and with all the rain, everything is watered and the rats are drinking water from these pots. And I just really accidentally spoke to someone whose their first idea was, well, let's just put poison in the water. And that opened up my little bit of the East Village. It opened up a huge discussion about, well, let's not poison the water. And it was really new information to me that people thought this was the way to combat this.
I think like an observation I'll make is you are building community in real time. And I so admire that, right? And I think that like that those neighbor to neighbor conversations, like I know the tree outside, so I'm part of a co-op in Brooklyn, and the tree outside our building is like, it's both lovely and a surprisingly sore subject for people, right? And I always laugh because this is like my full-time job. I think about this all day, every day. And my one neighbor who feels it is his tree, right? Like there is no conversation to be had. So kudos for even being able to have those conversations. But I think that's what's interesting, right? It's like our urban forest is both a major social infrastructure issue, and it's also an issue of our homes and our blocks. And it actually is happening at all of those scales. And so that's why it's like when people ask me what to do, it's both. It is like you saw my slides, talk to your friends and neighbors. I'll also call the mayor. It's actually, we need all of those things. So I just want to like appreciate you for what you're doing in your own community, because that's what we all need to be doing.
Right. But I think in the book, Urban Forests, Jill points out just that's how people have felt forever, this emotional connection to a small bit of land. And I think that that has to be like reactivated if we're going to really achieve these goals. And, there's a bit of plant blindness with supers, I'll say. So, there's work to be done.
Definitely. I wanted to ask Emily, kind of your opinion. I know we talk about this a lot in the coalition and about, private landowners. And do you expect landowners to want to be involved in urban forest development? I know, like Kathleen just said, obviously drawing that human connection is so important, and showing the importance of trees. But how do you expect private landowners to react?
Yeah, it's such a good question. It's a great question because it's such a big category, right? So a private landowner can be, a small co-op, Brooklyn, Lower East Side, right? Upper East Side. It can be like the Catholic Church. It can be NYU. It can be an Amazon warehouse, right? It can be so many different things. So how I think about it is a little bit like I try to break it down, right? And so I think a lot of private property owners, like small homeowners, we'll call them small residential homeowners, I think a lot of them have that emotional connection that Kathleen was just talking about, that the book talks about, where it's like, and that emotional connection could be positive or negative, right? It could be, I love it, I need my tree, or it could be, this darn tree is clogging up my storm drain. But whatever it is, it tends to be that more emotional, experiential. And I would actually argue, and I'm not able to share this data yet, but we did a poll of New York City voters, and people love trees. So the people who are mad about trees, we have them, but people generally really love trees. I feel very much more confident saying this. So I think that that's one set of strategies. And my belief is there need to be better incentive programs for private, like small residential homeowners or smaller residences, because it can be expensive. And that we need, I'll go back to Ray's point. Like, I love, Ray, what you said about like, we need as many like arborists as we have plumbers. Like, amen. That's an awesome vision. And they need to be affordable. They need to be the guy who, like, you know, like I call Henry Myers plumbing when my sink clogs. Like, you know, I want to call Henry Myers up the block and be like, oh, I'm having a problem, Henry. Can you come over? Like, I want that to be my New York. And it shouldn't always be like a $3,000 thing. Maybe it's like a $150 thing. So I think there's that. There's a whole set of solutions. And we actually believe that there should be potentially tax incentives, right? For caring for trees on private property. So we think there are ways that other kinds of environmental goods get incentivized on private property. Like, why wouldn't we incentivize trees? I'll also name that, like, my belief is that utility companies stand to benefit from trees because of the energy savings. And so I would love to see a utility like Con Ed, who actually is a member of Forest for All NYC. I would love to see them start thinking about outreach to their ratepayers, which I think is all of us, right? Or like almost all of us, because they have access to the New York City population in a way that, like, as proud as I am about the diversity of our coalition, right? And you all are representing different neighborhoods. I don't have 8 million mailing addresses, right? Like, I have something very different. And so I think that if we could activate some of our business leaders to think about how they're connecting to their constituents, potentially providing rebates, providing incentives, I think we could be really powerful. And I think it's not going to happen in the next 2 months. I think we can get there in a few years. I feel really confident. And then I think there's institutional landowners, right? And those are landowners, again, like NYU, Columbia, big churches. I want to see those folks engaged because of their own sustainability goals, right? So a lot of those institutions either have or probably soon will have sustainability goals. They'll have carbon goals. And I'm so excited. I want to make sure that this is incorporated. So I try to break it down. We need rules, we need incentives, and we need culture. And it's sort of all of those different things.
Wow. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, like you were saying, with incentives, trees provide such services, you know, cleaning water, reducing energy dependency, all of those things. They should absolutely, they're worth it. And if you have a piece of land and you're willing to put a tree or two on it, yeah, awesome.
And it generally raises property values, right?
Yeah.
So like, that can have an unintended consequence where, right, if we're doing things that raise property values and that causes displacement, we want to be aware. I don't want to be like too pie in the sky, but I think there's a lot of ways that property values shift in New York City. And so I think that this is probably one that's for the better.
Yeah. Any other questions or just thoughts on the book at all as we kind of tie this all together? Seems so crazy to be saying that. Does anybody want to share any standout quotes or snippets from the book? I can share mine. I have it written down somewhere. So one that really stuck out for me was on page 238. I wrote that down. And it was said by the parks commissioner at the time, Henry Stern. And he said, you have to kill the trees to save the forest. I don't know. That just really stuck with me. I think that, yeah, I don't know. That was my most standout kind of line from the book. And it, you know, we've talked a lot about IPM and just pests in general in New York City. That's something that really stuck with me. Yeah, go ahead, Kathleen.
Oh, no, yeah, I remember now that you mentioned that. I don't know, pest management's a whole sort of different category, but I don't know that you have to destroy something to make something better. I just don't think you do.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw Ray.
You've just unmuted me, so I'll jump in. I just wanted to share an anecdote about Henry Stern, because when Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza was being reconstructed, we wanted first to get sort of a beachhead just to get the thing going. And there was this one scraggly tree, and the commercial property that had a hand with this part of the park property, it was up to them to do the demolition. And they, they, they did not want to pay for saving this very scraggly tree. And the deal almost fell apart over it. And I had to get a New York assemblyman, and this was the days of faxing, to fax and say, please don't let the deal fall apart over this tree. And they ended up moving that tree. And then we had big trees also right along the roadway that was going to be turned into parkland and remapped. And one of the two of those huge London plane sycamores also got moved. And it's just, to me, the most amazing photo. So Henry defended those trees, and he cared immensely about trees. And I'm curious the context that he said that quote, because out of context, it's hard to understand what he was getting at. Would you like to elaborate?
Yeah, no, I know that it was used in terms of, forget, it was in response to a crisis, and kind of, mitigating any further damage. But it really just resonated with me in terms of, yeah, one, as Kathleen is saying, you should never have to do that. But I think kind of in this crazy world of things coming up, and we try to adapt quickly, but we never really know what to do. Even with spotted lanternfly, it was like, I don't know, just kill them. And there wasn't really a clear path of what we were going to do. It's evolved, it always does, but that's kind of what stuck with me. I think I was just in that space about spotted lanternfly, but I learned a lot about Commissioner Stern in this book that I was not familiar with him at all. And he seemed like, he was quite a force as a commissioner. So that was really interesting for me to learn. Sorry, Ray, you had your hand up, and then I'll go to you, Eileen.
Yeah, I'll just I admired Henry Stern's depictions in the book. He was quite a great person, it seemed, for trees. I also want to say just diversification is also a solution. You can't, like
Yeah,
monocrops. You can't just plant the same tree indefinitely and not expect to have problems. So.
absolutely. Couldn't agree more. All right, Eileen, ask you to unmute.
Yeah, Jess, I don't know if you're prepared to talk about this, but I remember, I think it was about a year and a half ago, and they were ash, maybe. Two large trees were taken down from the canopy of Madison Square Park. And I remember, that was the decision, the best way to deal with it. And so it's an example of deciding to save the forest. Do you want to comment about that decision?
Yeah, so those had emerald ash borer. There was two ashes standing right next to each other in the park, and they had it. So unfortunately, they had to come down. Yeah, and it's funny because it's not funny, but in Madison Square Park, we're such an isolated small park that, we have English elms, we have American elms, we have, we had the ashes, but, we kind of are like a great spot for protecting biodiversity, which is kind of like a weird thing when you think about it, but we're kind of lucky. We're in a nice little protected spot. So a lot of the pests and pathogens don't always get to us as fast, and we're kind of able to adapt, which I find very interesting.
I know that it's always when a tree comes down in the park, the neighborhood passers through are always upset.
Oh,
They
yes,
always think it's a
absolutely.
bad decision.
Absolutely. But luckily, we always have a reason to back it up because we never want to take a tree down ever. But we do, like Ray said, we are planning for the future, and we are diversifying that canopy to mitigate, if a pest comes in and we only have 5 species of trees, you're in big trouble. So, we're really trying to diversify. But I do want to share, I know we've talked a lot about IPM, but I do just want to share one example of here in the park, when we've kind of didn't use pesticides because we weren't going to anyway. But we had some buttonbush, which is a native plant. It likes wet environments, and it was covered in aphids, just covered. And I was like, I can spray them off, but do I have the time to do that? Just never did it. Time goes on, ladybug, 1 ladybug, 2 ladybugs, they just start going to town on the aphids, and very quickly looked just right across the pathway, and in our tree wells we had some white oaks, and there were ladybug larvae on the leaves, and within a couple of weeks knocked out that entire aphid problem. So I think it just in general, not just with the urban forest, but if you keep your systems healthy and in check, they will be healthy and in check most of the time. I just like to share that story as, hope that there are ways to do these things without interfering too much. So yeah, I think with that, we'll close the night out and the book club. Thank you again so much, Emily. This has been wonderful. I love hearing you talk about anything, but especially forest related. So you will be getting an email from me probably tonight for a survey. I welcome any comments, suggestions, ideas that you may have. And if you want to just come off mute and we can all thank Emily and have a great night.
Thank you for having me,
sorry,
y'all. It's
sorry,
really
you
a
couldn't
pleasure.
unmute.
I just wanted to thank everybody. It was wonderful to be with you all, and I learned a lot from you all. So thank you.
Thanks. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye, y'all.